terms of investment for passenger ridership.
Well, that would be Amtrak.
And it is in California that we lead the nation.
Well, we have in
The second most busiest
that's
corridor,
right.
the third most busiest corridor.
Of the top
fifth.
5 busiest Amtrak corridors, the busiest is in the Northeast corridor, but the 3 of the next 4 are in California. The Capital corridors, the San Joaquins, and the Los Angeles-San Diego-Losan corridor.
Thank you.
Mr. Valadao.
Thank you. Mr. Richards, in every country they do a cost-benefit analysis for individual segments that lead to a complete project. Have you done an independent risk analysis for this first construction segment?
I want to be careful how I answer this question because I believe we have, but I want to make sure that it's consistent with what you may have in mind. But what I would say, Mr. Valadao, is that we've been very clear in looking at building this project in segments that we want each segment to have the funding before we start, and we want it to have independent utility. The biggest risk is the first segment. There's no question about it.
The GAO states that the authority did not conduct a risk and uncertainty analysis, and that was on page 19 of their report. And when you say that this first segment is the riskiest and the starting point, it sounds like it's a pretty serious issue that we should be doing a risk analysis when so much taxpayer money is on the line. In a recent court litigation concerning the Merced to Fresno EIR, the authority claimed that the amount of estimated costs stated in various master agreements with local agencies totaling $1.5 billion were somehow double counted, and that some of these costs were actually part of the estimated $1.2 to $1.8 billion cost for constructing high-speed the HST project infrastructure for the 29-mile construction package CP1. Can you explain which of the costs in the master agreement tasks order were double counted?
I'm sorry, Congressman, I don't have that information here. We will absolutely provide it for the record.
Okay. Can you confirm the total cost of constructing CP1, including all costs associated with the work outlined in the various master agreements with local agencies, the cost of ROW project acquisition, and the cost of mitigation?
The construction package 1 that the staff is going to bring to the board next week is for $985 million. I want to make sure in answering that way that I've included all of the costs that you just laid out. I will again confirm that with the staff, and we will follow up on the record.
Thank you. What do you mean as the people also get for this? What do you mean as the people also get for this investment? Do we get a high-speed rail service? Do we even get an electrified system? And it looks like we're getting the first construction and earth moving is getting going. But do we actually get an electrified track, or do we have permission, or does the environmental impact report allow us to use diesel Amtrak trains on the existing rail, or the new rail that's going to be constructed right alongside of the existing?
Yes.
It does. Does Kings County lose the Corcoran and Hanford station, or are we able to keep those?
We don't have any plans to stop Amtrak service. It's not ours to stop between Corcoran, Wasco, and
So we will continue to have a Wasco station as well?
Yes, we're not closing down the station.
What happens when Amtrak moves its, because that's part of the plan for the first segment is to move the Amtrak trains over to the new rail line.
Well,
and the new rail line doesn't go through or have any plans for stations there.
As I've explained numerous times in Kings County, we support the continuation of rail service on those smaller stations.
So we're going to have 2 Amtrak trains running literally a couple miles away from each other, up and down.
We could have express trains as well as local trains. That is very common around the world. But we're not the ones in charge of that. What we're saying is we're creating a facility that Amtrak can use to improve its service. It doesn't mean we want to orphan these smaller stations. And in fact, we don't. And I've committed to the people in Kings County and Kern County that we want to work with them and our state transportation authority to make sure that rail service continues there.
All right, thank you.
This is kind of off the point a little bit, but pertaining to this, we're doing the passenger reauthorization bill. Is there anything in the new area with Amtrak that would be involved in the new passenger reauthorization bill?
Well, I think we'd want to work with your office and Amtrak on that. You know, we have a very good relationship with Amtrak. In fact, our new chief engineer was the chief engineer of Amtrak. We have, Mr. Morales announced an agreement in Washington a few months ago with Amtrak to coordinate on the procurement of high-speed train vehicles, because they're looking at things for the Northeast. I think PRIA gives us a lot of opportunities.
We would ask you to work with us. That's obviously a huge goal of this committee, is to get the passenger reauthorization bill done this fall. And if there is any concerns with that, we just want to be upfront and working with
We
you.
appreciate your leadership on that bill, Mr. Chairman. We will thank you for that invitation. We'll take it up.
Thank you. And I have a couple just quick follow-up questions.
Yes,
We do want to finish by noon, but I'll allow my colleagues, if either have additional questions, we can either submit them for the record to be answered at a later date at the conclusion of this hearing, or we can continue on as you see fit. So let me ask my questions, and if you'd like to.
I'll make it easy, Mr. Chairman. At this point, all the questions that I've highlighted, I think I've asked, and I will submit any further questions for the record.
Thank you. Mr. Valadao, likewise. Thank you. So just to follow up on Mr. Thompson's point, the $68.5 billion, does that include rolling stock?
No, it does not.
So
Wait a second, excuse me. It does?
So the $13 billion
Excuse
that
me.
a private investor would pay for does include rolling stock as well?
Yes, they would put up the rolling stock and collect the, and I'm sorry, I misspoke. The project total is the project total, which includes rolling stock. So they would put up money. Mr. Chairman, if I could just take a moment. This approach that we have is not like when I was on BART, where we had public employees operating the trains, maintaining the trains. Our fundamental approach here is that we make a public investment. The private sector comes in and bids for the rights to operate that. They will put up the rolling stock, they'll collect the fares, they'll do the operations and maintenance.
With
So-
no ongoing subsidy?
With no ongoing subsidy. That is not only the law, but that's also what we think is appropriate, and it's consistent with what's happened around the world. We don't see any need for an ongoing subsidy. In fact, our hope is that we'll be like the line in France that just paid back hundreds of millions of euros to help pay off some of the existing cost of the capital of the system. We can't promise you that at this point, but that's what we believe will happen.
Thank you. And of the $13.3 billion or $13.1 billion that would be the private investment, what percentage of that is rolling stock versus actual asset infrastructure?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think Mr. Thompson is right. I want to point out for this committee that we are refining our models in ways suggested by his group as well as by the GAO. And I think the GAO reports become a little bit like astrology. Everybody gets out of it what they want. I'm looking at their quote that said, our funding, which relies on both public and private sources, faces uncertainty. Yes, that's true. The authority's plan recognizes the uncertainty of the current funding environment, so is building the project in phases and has identified an alternative funding source. And they said that that's a reasonable approach to doing this.
Thank you. And just clarifying for the record, I've talked to the French. They are investing in rail all over the world, and they're not doing it just because they think that it's great for air quality or environmental quality. They're doing it because they are doing it in places where they can turn a profit for France.
Sure.
And for their company. Let me just close by the one thing that we did not touch on today, which is an important part of this. You've entered into a contract with Tudor Perini. The construction bid on this, we have a number of questions pertaining to that bid process that we'll submit in writing. But the one thing that did come up in Chapter 2 of the business plan, you explained that the private sector will be retained for design-build contracts, and the benefits of doing so are to eliminate the risk, especially cost overruns, which are transferred to the private sector.
Right.
So can you promise us today that this is, because we went to a construction package 1, the citizens of California will not have to pay anything in this initial project because it is on the private investor to have 100% of that cost controlled?
What I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, is that absolutely using design-build will minimize any risk of overruns. I'm not going to sit here and promise that there won't be, because there might be something that happens. I will tell you that I worked when I was on BART with this contractor They built the BART to San Francisco Airport project. They also built the new airport terminal. Both were under design builds. Our experience with them under a design build contract was that it was completed on time and within our project budget.
Are the cost overruns because of change orders, or are they cost overruns because a private industry did not manage the project?
Well, in one case, we had somebody run over an endangered snake, which shut us down for a couple of weeks. But, I mean, generally what happens is because yes, I know. But
We have a lot of fairy shrimp here in the valley, and those are hard to see.
I get it. But generally what happens, normally what's the cause of, the normal cause of overruns is that somebody's handed a design and then is able to say, oh, well, this design doesn't work, and they come in and say, now we're hitting you with a change order. Under a design build contract, they're handed about 30% of the design. They complete the design and build to their own design. Makes it very hard for them to come in and say, two pieces didn't fit here, when they're the ones having to complete the design. I agree with Lou Thompson. There are risks in design build contracts. We need to stay on top of those risks, but in general, we think it's the best protection that the public has against overruns.
So the $983 million that is set aside for construction package 1, if there are overruns, is there a contingency? Is there a 10% contingency?
First of all, if there are overruns, they're on the contractor, unless there's something that we did. And we don't think that that's going to be the case. Secondly, in terms of our contingency, what it would probably mean is that for the next segment from Fresno down to Bakersfield, we'd have to build a fewer miles of track. That's the way we're sort of handling contingencies here, as opposed to setting aside a dollar amount. But we feel very good about these numbers. GAO felt pretty good about our forecasting methodology.
Thank you. And the final question, this question has come up a lot in our conference. When we go back to Washington, D.C. after the August break, we're going to be working on an appropriations bill, funding bills, as well as came up last year under the transportation bill. If there is a $38 billion shortfall, or there's a shortfall of any magnitude that the federal government is going to have to come up with money for, the question that my colleagues have come back to me and asked, for the other 49 states that will contribute to the state of California, why wouldn't the California voters demand that this goes back to the ballot? If it's gone from a $33 billion project to a 68 or whatever the final number may be, at a certain point, do you feel the need to go back to voters?
I think if you look at the Proposition 1A, Mr. Chairman, the voters' protection, I think the first line of defense was that the proposition by its terms required the legislature to appropriate the money. And these questions were before the legislature last year. I would just say, and I know there are a lot of questions here, and I'm sure you wanted a lot of them answered. I'd like the opportunity to do it. But, Mr. Chairman, we're not going to be coming to you in your role on this committee or to your colleagues looking for $50 billion of federal appropriations. We're going to build this in pieces. The next piece after the Valley is to jump over the Tehachapi's to get to Palmdale. It's about $10 billion. We have about half of that money right now from the bonds that are left. We think we can get there. That will be an incredibly useful project and will answer some of Mr. Valadeo's concerns about getting us to the gates of LA. With each step, we will come to you where we're asking for federal support, having looked at the other things that we can do to put the dollars together. And we've laid out some of those in our testimony, but that's how we feel we can build this in pieces in a careful way, and it's not going to depend on those levels of federal dollars. And I think there's a whole lot of other private sector dollars from concessions and other things that we've just started to look at. The High-Speed Rail Authority in the past had never looked at those things. As I said, in Japan, 30% of their revenues come from real estate around the stations. The opportunities, looking at Fresno, Bakersfield, other places, Palmdale, that's why some of the mayors there are very excited in Palmdale and Fresno. So we think that there are a number of different things. We're going to do our job to put as many of those pieces together before we come to you, Mr. Chairman, and ask you for federal dollars. And when we do, we may look for things in new forms that aren't just the old grants, earmarked grants that your Congress has basically moved away from, but areas where we can work together to accelerate and focus private sector investment. And I know that that's your interest, and Mr. Chairman, we're committed to that too. We think that there are some things that could be done in PREA or other places that can get the private sector involved earlier. So it's a complex topic. There are risks with this program, but there are great benefits. Our job is to manage those risks. We're getting lots of advice as to how to do that. But to do it in a way, we really believe we can build this project for the benefit of Californians and not leave people hanging out to dry with something that doesn't have value. And I appreciate you letting me make that statement right at the end, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, would you
Costa.
yield on that point? I appreciate all the time and effort, Congressman Denham, that you've provided in this effort, both when you were in Sacramento and now. I would just like to opine that I think the projects that we build, that we invest in California or anywhere else in the country will at certain times be more popular or less popular. But I think it is the legislature's responsibility not only to determine whether or not they want to issue the bonds that the voters approved, but also they have, as was stated by Mr. Richards, the approval by the federal funding that we have achieved. I am a big supporter of Temperance Flat, a reservoir proposal that's up here. I hope that we will have a ballot measure next year that will provide funding for Temperance Flat. It's currently advertised at $2.5 billion. I don't know if that will be the ultimate cost. I would hate to see a precedent set where we pass a water bond measure next year, we commit to build water storage projects, and then it becomes unpopular for whatever various reasons. I remember the Dinky Creek project at PG&E cost overrun and became very unpopular, and that we didn't complete it. It's complete today. And I hope we'll be able to get the funding for Temperance Flat and that we'll complete it. But gee, if it became unpopular 4 years from now or 6 years from now, then we say, well, gee, maybe we ought to go back to the voters again. Right? We all are so frustrated. It's so hard to get things done. And let's work together. Let's work through this so that we can get things done, whether it be for water or transportation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. And as always, we look forward to working in a bipartisan fashion on this. And I think the difference is, and the challenge here is, the 9.95 was approved by California voters. And there's a $38 billion shortfall that we're going to have to convince our colleagues whether or not this is a good investment for the other 49 states. That's something we will continue to discuss. And we certainly have a number of questions for a number of our witnesses here today that we will submit and ask for. I will ask you as a Valley representative, as chair of the rail committee, we have a lot to work on with high-speed rail. We certainly have a lot to work on with the passenger reauthorization bill. But as a Valley legislator, as Valley legislators, all of us, this is about constituent services as well. And so as we move forward and look at each of these individual parcels and the farming that's going to go on, the businesses that are going to continue on, we want to make sure that as constituent services that we're addressing our community needs as well. And so we'll be discussing each of those from that perspective as well. If there are no further questions from any members of the committee, seeing none, I'd like to thank each of our witnesses for their testimony today. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by other members or members of this panel today and witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I'd like to thank our witnesses again for their testimony. If no members have anything to add, the committee stands adjourned.